This week on the podcast, talking to a Google Analytics engineer about the dangers of using Google Analytics just out of the box. This is Using the Whole Whale, a podcast that brings you stories of data and technology in the nonprofit world. My name is George Weiner, your host and the chief whaler of WholeWhale.com. Thanks for joining us. A quick warning about this week's episode. We get pretty geeky. Simo Ahava is an absolute Google Analytics and GTM ninja, and we talk about some implementations of pieces. What I hope you listen for, though, is the types of questions you should be asking as a leader of a department or organization about the data that are presented to you. And keep in mind, this is coming from our guest who's a practitioner. He's in there doing the work and has seen a lot of errors made and lessons learned. So I hope, even if maybe some of the technical elements of this podcast go beyond you, listen to the tone and the approach that he's talking about when we're discussing looking at the numbers that somebody's presenting to you. Today's guest is Simo Ahava. He is the co-founder of 8-Bit Sheep and also a Google developer expert in Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager. Simo, how's it going?
Good, thanks. And hello, everyone. And thanks so much for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to this talk, man.
Oh, well, our team at Whole Whale are big fans. Simo also has an epic blog where he gives away tons of tools and tactics, and frankly, this is the guy we go to. His blog, when we're stuck, this is the person who unsticks us. Simo, can you tell us a little bit about your work and maybe what's going on at 8-Bit Sheep?
Sure. I guess the closest thing to a job title that I currently hold is analytics developer. So I work with software development teams, service development teams, and I try to figure out what the role of analytics is in that process. So it's a bit different to what many people consider analytics to be, which is like marketing analytics and business analytics. I'm more interested in figuring out how do we measure stuff well and how do we integrate that into software development, for example. So my daily job basically is to go to clients and go to customers and go to companies I like working with and try to figure out how to turn that organization around so that analytics and data isn't just something that's tacked on. That's something that is an end goal of itself, but it actually becomes a very valuable side product of what that organization does in terms of service and software development. So that's my kind of daily job that I've chosen for myself. I'm very ambitious in what I want to dedicate my time to. But then I also moonlight as this blogger that you mentioned. It's my hobby blog. It's been my hobby for, it's 6 years now, which is crazy considering it's only been me from day one. I have a couple of guest authors there every now and then, but it's still just this place where I get to vent, where I get to pour out my heart's content, where I get to share all this cool stuff that I've been working on with no strings attached, no mailing lists, no conversion goals, nothing. It's just this kind of dump for my brain material, and I just love it. It's the one thing that keeps me really focused and interested in this industry.
Yeah, it's great. It's also hilarious because, Simo, you literally post your own blog stats and the page views, and it's awesome to see this type of growth over time and interest as you really do unselfishly give away a lot of content. We have also seen you on stage a number of times presenting, and I'm hoping that you can elaborate on some of these topics around analytics and the thinking for our audience. And the one I really love is your war on out of the box. Can you explain, the perils of taking a tool like Google Analytics out of the box and assuming it is set and ready to go?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe it is if you're listening to the show, just take a moment and think about your organization and think about the kind of things you're trying to measure in your organization. What is your growth KPIs? What is your metric for success? So you have these KPIs in mind, and you have these metrics in mind, and you have this data in mind. And then think about a tool like Google Analytics, and think about the engineers who've developed Google Analytics in their offices in Mountain View and Irvine, California, wherever, the origins of Google Analytics are. And now think about, do these engineers actually know what your organization is about? Do they know your goals? Do they know your KPIs? Do they even know the industry you're in? Do they know what kind of people visit your site? And when you unravel it that way, it becomes obvious that anything that the tool gives out of the box just simply can't be tuned into the idiosyncrasies of whatever this is that makes your organization tick. So I've been, and it's mind-boggling to see so many deployments of Google Analytics that have zero or a very little customization. Maybe a couple of goals here and there, but no events, no audiences, no filters, no segmentation. It's just a bare bones implementation. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking about this, like up to a point of exhaustion. And I'm pretty sure my current feelings about this are that it's almost better to have no data at all than to have that basic setup, because the basic setup can be so misleading. If you're only collecting page views, you're missing out on so much interaction, and you'll be interpreting pages that are converting really poorly in terms of like time on page or bounce rate. Could actually be some of your most powerful pages, but you don't know this because you're not collecting those events. You haven't customized that setup enough. So I've been really passionate about this question. I'm not sure why, because I don't have skin in the game, but I feel like we've reached a point of maturity over the years, especially since Google Analytics has made analytics affordable to anyone. I think we've reached a point of maturity now that it's just not excusable anymore to have that basic setup. And it's not okay anymore to just be happy with whatever data you can get, but you actually have to introduce that ambition to your processes and have to make your organization understand that there's no one-click wonder. There's no instant gratification with these analytics tools, but you actually have to tell them very clearly that, hey, this is my organization. This is how my organization works, and I want you as the analytics tool to tell me what I want to know, and I'll help you do that.
It's so funny to hear your passion on the topic of what's possible with configuration, because you like sculpt and craft and find hacks and tweaks that I think push even the people at Google, which is hilarious. I want to come back though to your better not to have it at all type of statement, because I sometimes feel like there's an assumption that, look, we're going to set it up. We're going to turn on Google Analytics, and someone smart in 6 or 12 months will come in and they'll have all this retroactive data, right? And so where is that assumption broken when you're talking about things like, events or goals?
There's a decay to data. Data isn't always fresh. Data isn't always good quality. Like you can look back at historical data, and you can draw assumptions from it, but you have to remember that it's bound to the context of the time when it was collected. So one of the big challenges of having a constantly evolving analytics process is that evolution implies some kind of growing up and some kind of becoming more complex in a way. That's a very typical way of evolving in the technical landscape. So the historical part of things, so like you said, let's just start collecting data, and I'm sure that it will be useful at some point. It just doesn't necessarily hold any water, because even if you are collecting those page views today, when you look back a year from now, you might have a completely different measurement scheme in place, and you might have had a site redesign in place and something like that. And then you'll be looking back at today's data, and at that point, many organizations fall into this sunk cost fallacy, where they look at, hey, we have that data. It's better than nothing, so let's just use that data. We have it there. Why shouldn't we use it? And the sunk cost fallacy is because we've spent that money putting it into place, so it has to be useful even a year or two from now. So we look back at that data and we try to draw conclusions and say that, okay, the bounce rate on our sales checkout funnel was so and so a year ago, and now it's so and so better. So it's obvious we've made huge leaps, and we can continue on this track. And that's the problem. Without carefully, constantly working with that analytics process and annotating all the changes that happen on your site, and making sure that the events stay consistent throughout, and making sure your conversions are consistent, it can be detrimental to look back in that time window and to look back on data that wasn't collected carefully enough and wasn't collected with deliberation. And I think that's been a big problem throughout, often precisely because what you said rings very true, is that we'll collect data now. Maybe someday someone will come and do something with it, which I think is, funnily enough, it's also a big problem in more mature organizations who set up these so-called data lakes, these huge repositories of data, collecting data from all these data sources, hoping that someday somebody will figure out what to do with it. So it's not just a problem with these low maturity data organizations, but it's also a problem throughout. And it's something that requires a lot of discipline in an organization to make sure that that data is always collected with deliberation and collected with thought, with forethought, especially.
Yeah, the idea of a stitch in time and the necessity of the initial, design. It is so often in, web projects an afterthought, and, we come across just as many of these sort of disasters where they've invested so much in this bright, shiny new car and then didn't install the dashboard. And you're like, wait a minute, what happens when that car runs out of gas? You're like, I don't know, it sits in the parking lot. It's fine there.
Yeah, this is something that this is pervasive in software development as well. And I think anybody who's worked with service design or even just created a website or participated in a redesign knows how the kind of the waterfall model can be counterintuitive, where you do this big, huge planning stage, and then you do an RFP and try to get some proposals who could do that plan. And then you deliver that plan to the developers who work like 6 months on the project, but then you do the push the site out. And this type of thinking is very popular because it's easy to budget, and it caters to these silos that we've built into our organization. It's the marketing team's project, so let's have them handle that. But the problem with that is that one is the fact that if you want to be data informed, if you want to make decisions based on data, it's not something you can do in these kinds of batches. It's not something you can do with 6-month delays, because data doesn't kind of hold up for you. Data doesn't go on hold. It keeps on collecting, and it keeps on coming, and it keeps on decaying at the same time. So another kind of thread that brings this line of thinking together with what I said about those out of the box things is that we have to figure out how to make our organizations more agile when it comes to data. How do we make it an iterative process? How do we constantly evaluate the data we're collecting? And for example, if you're in Europe, this is not just a nice thing to have. You're actually legally complied to do this. You have to take care that you're deliberately collecting and annotating your data sets, because otherwise you'll be in violation of things like GDPR and other EU privacy laws. Not to mention the national laws your country might have put up for how to handle data. So it's not just in the realm of some guy from Finland being angry about how these things work. We're actually talking about legal ramifications, and the same thing in the US with things going on in California and all this talk about these privacy models.
Yeah. The other piece about understanding is you have to actually understand the metrics. And I think one of the false senses of security we have when we look at a Google Analytics dashboard and, generic top level sessions and users and bounce rate is I'd be willing to bet that 90% of the people that use those words do not understand at the elemental level what those actually are. And that then drives at how can you trust any insight that is then brought if you don't understand those core pieces. So I'm wondering if you can tease that out and maybe just explain to the audience what a bounce rate is and what it actually is.
Sure. This reminds me of a client I had way back in the day. I'm definitely not going to name any names, but they were very proud that their CEO was so invested in data and so interested. And I felt like, wow, this is going to be such a great project. But what it actually meant was that the CEO received a report on his desk once a month, which was a printed out Google Analytics dashboard. So just a dashboard screenshot printed out. And that was how this company was data informed. And the problem here was that all the bad decisions made on bad metrics were compounded by giving this person who's in charge, giving them this really filtered and really like regurgitated view of these metrics. And the report had things like bounce rate and average time on page. And it was the aggregate report. And I heard that Avinash was on the show, and Avinash Kaushik is famous for his quip that all data in aggregate is crap. Like all that data, all those total visits, total bounce rate, total time on page, it's useless data. You're not segmenting. You're not asking the right questions. But if I were to unravel this problem, let's take a metric like bounce rate, and typically the description of bounce rate is single page sessions. So users who came to the site, viewed something, and immediately left. That's the kind of description of bounce rate used often even in the Google Analytics IQ quiz or the certification. So it's pretty pervasive. The problem is that it's not actually true at all. A bounce rate in Google Analytics is a single interaction session, a session that had a single interaction. Now this could be a page view, which it most typically is, but it could also be just a single event. So that's possible as well. The problem with this, I saw the site and I left immediately, is that we don't know if they left immediately. If the site doesn't have any events being collected, or if something's broken in data collection, it's possible the user spent 3 hours on the landing page, just looking at the page, calling all the phone numbers, making orders worth of millions of dollars. But because that Google Analytics setup only collected the single page rate, GA claims that it was a bad session because it was a bounce. But that user could have been your best client throughout the year, but they only sent a single hit to GA. So bounce rate is a very, very bad quality index, at least in aggregate. Once you start segmenting into the data and choosing some filters like users who are first-time visitors, who didn't make any purchases, who didn't send any events, at that point bounce rate becomes somewhat useful. But I would still be very, very careful about using any single metric as a KPI, any metric completely in isolation of the context. And bounce rate is just way too easily taken as some kind of a benchmark. And I even created this website called whatisagoodbouncerate.com that it's going to be in the show notes and people can take a look at it. But it kind of highlights my attitude towards bounce rate. I won't spoil it anymore. I'll let you take a look at the website yourself.
You can find that. I love that question because, you're just trolling the person asking it. I'm really excited about going to that now. For the leaders listening who are not data analysts, a good number of them, and who may be like turning, rosy right now because they're embarrassed. They're like, oh, I look at a dashboard and I look at roll-up numbers. The piece that I think is the heuristic, the thing to take away is to ask questions of especially averages, aggregates, roll-up numbers, because there's so much behind it, and pull those threads, act like a child in that, like, no, what is a session? What is a bounce rate? We had a client who had a high bounce rate on, a donate landing page, and they were looking at all these sources of traffic to it, and they're like, these bounce rates are terrible. Everyone's leaving. I was like, you understand that, like, to get to your donate portal, they have to click and leave your site, right? So wait a minute, it's a success. You literally want someone to bounce, and then you stop doing the activities that drive traffic to the page. Like, there's no meaningful insight that will come from this.
Yeah. I've just been in the trenches for too long to not be cynical. So obviously I'm going to be talking about these worst case scenarios and talking about leaders who made the bad choices. But it's actually quite easy to be attuned to this. And I think your point about asking questions is just so incredibly important. Having somebody, when somebody tells you in a celebratory manner that, hey, we got a conversion rate uplift of 5%, for example, next question is, so what did you do? Like what was the impact? Did you measure across the segments, or did you focus on a specific segment? What was the impact by our campaigns? There's so many things you can hide behind a metric. And this is part of the consultancy paradigm that I think is also a bit broken, is that consultants, especially in analytics and marketing, it's very easy for them to hide behind the numbers and claim something as a success that wasn't actually a success, because those numbers are so easy to manipulate, and it's so easy to just twist them around in just the right way to make the client or make the client's C-level believe that it was a success. And many of the things we measure with analytics aren't things that appear directly as a ROI. It might take months and months and months for the slow accumulation of growth to become visible in the KPI. So it's very easy for consultants to create these vendor locks and to try to boost their own importance by manipulating this data. And that's been one of my, I'm not sure I'm that liked and especially in Finnish consultancy circles, because my job is to shine light on these people and on these companies who try to be charlatans and who try to turn this data into a benefit for them when it's actually damaging to the company they're trying to represent and trying to help. So data is very volatile in that way. It's one of the key tenets I've always talked about data is that data is totally a passive medium. It has no agency. So whenever you hear somebody saying that the data tells us this or the data shows us this, it's like a warning flag going off, because that's not true. The data has no mouth. The data has no hands. There's a human being interpreting those ones and zeros and turning it into a business insight. So the first thing you have to do is question, what are the motives of this human being? Have they inspected the data closely enough to be able to make these, draw these conclusions? And I seriously do not envy anybody working in the C-level. I think for me personally, as a very tactical person, I think the amount of information you have to distill in order to make strategic decisions is just mind-boggling for me. It's a thing that I find, I respect people who can shoulder that responsibility. But my job as a consultant and as an analyst is to deliver the data in such a manner and present it in such a manner that not only is my report credible, but also that I'm challenged for it, that the person I'm talking to challenges me and asks me questions that I might not have had the wisdom to present autonomously. I might not have had the initiative to present myself. So I want to be challenged. I want the leaders to question and maybe after they question me enough and I've given them good enough answers, then we can skip that in future discussions and they can trust me from the get-go. But there has to be this kind of because analysts can make, they are storytellers, and what is a story but a beautiful lie. So I think it's just important to always be vigilant and always question those numbers, and at the very least, when you are trying to do a business decision that has an impact on the bottom line and you're using data to do that, at that point at least it's important to question it. Like, it's okay if you let some bounce rates go, slip through the fingers every now and then, or if it's okay to celebrate a great conversion rate every now and then. But once you're deciding whether or not to go in direction X or direction Y, and you're using data to inform yourself on that decision, at that point it's really important to question the validity of those numbers.
And it's time to feed the whales with a quick ad. Did you know that 83% of the people on average, according to M&R, that go to your donate page do not give? Check your doctor. Results may vary, but people leave your donate page at a staggering level. GetLighthouse.io allows you to create a list of emails that went to that donate page but didn't necessarily give, allowing you to send a note, a follow-up saying, hey, how can I help you give? It connects to Google Analytics and MailChimp to add this functionality to your existing site. Go check it out at getlighthouse.io, and back to our show. I want to put a pin in that because it's just, about the organizational adoption and strategies of using these enormous amounts of data. But I have a question from the whole whale analytics team, and like one that I'm forced to answer a lot. Don't worry, it's not and I got you, but here's the scenario, and our audience may not fully understand Google Tag Manager, so please also explain that as well. We have instances many times, clients that'll come in with Google Analytics installed, and then they'll have some hard-coded events and elements, and then I find myself needing to explain why we need to move everything onto Google Tag Manager because of, now you have to answer this. Why? Or should you, in a case where it's, entrenched setup, move on to Google Tag Manager?
So Google Tag Manager is a tool that you can download onto the website. It's basically a script library, which basically is a container for all your analytics and marketing tools. So instead of having like Google Analytics code running on the site and Google Ads code running on the site and Facebook code running on the site, you would only have Google Tag Manager container on the site, and the Google Tag Manager loads those extra dependencies by itself. So it's basically like a dependency management system for the front end. And Google Tag Manager has been my bread and butter since it was released, or since it was in beta actually in 2012. And I've been working daily with it and trying to talk about what it is. I still have a difficulty squeezing it into 15 seconds, but let's try here. So when the question is, we already have a nice setup working, why should we introduce another tool to handle that for us? And my first answer is maybe you don't. Maybe you're fine. Maybe your data is perfect and you have a great agile development system where new events are added as you want them and old events are purged. Data quality is constantly being monitored, and you have new releases of the site with continuous integration coming out every 2 weeks. So in those cases, fine. There's no need to stir the pot. If it's working, and you should be happy about that. But anecdotally, that's very rare. It's very rare to have a system in place that doesn't accumulate a lot of technical debt onto the site itself, which could be reduced by having Google Tag Manager there. And this becomes especially poignant when you have multiple versions of Google Analytics, for example. So you have some really old legacy stuff from 10 years ago. Then you have some code updates done 5 years ago. Then you have a couple of new updates from 3 years ago, and so on. Because it's just JavaScript. It's single lines of JavaScript that are very easy to miss when you're doing a redesign. And they're easy to miss because analytics, in technical terms, is a side effect. It's not the main functionality of your site isn't to produce data. Your main functionality of your site is to show pages and to have forms and to have buttons. And analytics is just a side effect of all this. It's just like something that comes as a side product when the user clicks a button. So it's very easy to miss that code because it's not actually doing anything. It's just collecting stuff. So when you have all these threads of code in the data, in the site code, you're accumulating technical debt that can bite you if you're not careful. It can result in site performance slowing down. It can result in all these performance costs. And Google Tag Manager in that situation is great because it's only a single dependency your site has to download in the site code itself. And everything else is handled, optimized, optimized for performance, optimized for security by Google Tag Manager itself. So the library kind of encapsulates all this logic inside it. And at that point, it becomes a great way to get rid of that technical debt on the site. And then you get the additional benefit of being able to deploy new pixels like Hotjar code or ClickTail or whatever marketing tags, analytics tags, advertising tags you want. You can deploy them through GTM without actually having to release a new version of the site at all because GTM handles this all for you. So it's just a great way to kind of remove some of the responsibility from the website itself to manage this analytics system. And Google Tag Manager takes that role very fluently.
All right, Allie, you hear that? This is exactly what I'm just going to play for you each time we have this debate. It's helpful. It's tough, though. You're like, oh, stay the course, don't cut, because it's a lot of work to lift and shift all of those or leave some behind and create new ones.
The migration isn't, definitely not downplaying it. It can be a huge undertaking, migrating all that stuff to Google Tag Manager, which is why there are certain ways to do it, which doesn't necessarily result in it being such a huge undertaking. For example, the way that I always do it is that instead of just starting to figure out what do I move and where, I just add Google Tag Manager to the site while the old code is still there. And then bit by bit, I add that new stuff into Google Tag Manager, and I leave the old stuff still there. And once I have feature parity, so once Google Tag Manager is collecting all the things I wanted to preserve from the old setup, at that point, I can make the big push and delete all that Google Analytics code in one single release, and then configure Google Tag Manager to collect to the actual analytics account. So the migration can be done in a somewhat painless way, but it's definitely not trivial. I'm not trying to say that it's like a weekend job. It's definitely requires some work.
Super helpful. Definitely going to be bringing that and replaying it for the team because, it's tough to sort of, make the case for yet another tool. Except this is one that Google is absolutely invested in. It makes too much sense and, has positive impacts for site speed and tracking over time. All right, Simo, we are going to play a quick game that I did not prepare you for at all because, it's our podcast and we have some fun. We're going to do pro versus con. So you can choose the pro side or con side on the following topic. Is a master dashboard, the executive dashboard, a good thing or bad thing? So assume this is a master dashboard rolled up into a Google Data Studio and, placed in front of the CEO. Do you want this is a good thing or bad thing?
So I'm gonna sit in that this is a good thing camp, but I'm gonna wave the flag in secret that this can also be a very bad thing.
You can't take
but
both sides. I'm gonna
take the pro side.
Quick back and forth. Make your point, and then I will make a counterpoint. Would you like to start or go second?
I can start. So having a master dashboard means that there's some data visible. Dashboards, the functionality of a dashboard is to make data visible. I've always thought that immersion is one of the ways to get an organization to understand data. So to have those dashboards all over the place, and especially close to the places where people congregate, like the water cooler, the war room, the backlog on the whiteboard. But what better place to also have one but the CEO's room or the boardroom where the decisions are being made. And the data doesn't have to be perfect, but it's just important to have the CEO or have the boss when they come into the building, the first thing they do when they go is they go into their room, have a cup of coffee and look at the numbers. I think that's super important to have that understanding that data is everywhere coming from the top down.
All right. There's a word and it's called complacency. It is the enemy of every winning team out there. And I believe that oversimplified, boiled down, roll up dashboards actually generate more complacency on a team. The illusion that we know what's going on, that there are no fires because this number is slightly higher than it was yesterday. So actually, we're instilling the seeds of destruction. What say you, Simo?
I agree with you.
No.
If that really were the case, I believe that complacency is a decision made by the organization. It's something you can actively fight against. And the way to actively fight against complacency in this case, which I do agree that it would be very harmful, is to constantly develop that dashboard and have a periodic meeting with the boss every 2 weeks, what's the sprint cycle of the company, and talk about that data and see if there's something that should be updated. Are there some metrics missing? The boss level can actually have some pretty interesting insights into the nitty-gritty of the operational data that's being collected. So the way that I would approach this situation is to put that dashboard in the office and say that, hey, let's have a chat every Friday. Let's have coffee at 1 p.m. Let's look at the data and talk about how we can develop this dashboard so that complacency doesn't kick in, and so that we don't fall into the trap of, hey, those numbers look great, let's not do anything. So I want to turn it into an iterative process where the boss is also included, and I want to tell the boss that, hey, your insights are really valuable, and this isn't just a painting, it's a living, breathing thing that you have to nurture.
The saying goes, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. When it comes to dashboards, there is widget overload. There are so many areas to add more and more numbers that we tend to fill the entire space available with as many numbers as possible. And this actually leads to fantastic distraction. Imagine driving down the road and needing to know what your freaking Twitter reach is. You would drive off of the road, you'd run out of gas. You were distracted by the sheer form and design of the tool of the master dashboard, which must encapsulate everything and give equal weight to all of the things, when that is certainly not the case.
This isn't fair. You've prepared your answers.
I didn't know you could have chosen either side.
I could hear you reading from the paper. So there's a straw man you just introduced, which is that this master dashboard actually has to include all this information, and I don't absolutely agree with that. I do agree that a dashboard that has too much stuff is totally distracting, and that's again something we need to fight against. One of the things we do with data collection, which is also applies to data visualization, is we start with an iterative process, and which is incremental. And the same kind of agility that I just mentioned about these talking with the boss every week about the dashboard is also designed to kind of do this Marie Kondo thing with the data dashboard and get rid of everything that doesn't bring you joy, get rid of everything that doesn't lead to good decisions. Dashboard doesn't mean that if you delete a widget from the dashboard, doesn't mean you stop collecting that data. It just means that you're making space. And I've always dreamed of my ideal dashboard would be something that has just one number and one graph, like whatever those numbers reflect or whatever the graph is. I want it to be vague enough to not force me to every day deliberate, what does this mean? What does this mean? And I want it to be tantalizing enough that it invites me to dig deeper into the data whenever I see an anomaly. I don't think a dashboard should be a report. It shouldn't be something that has too much text, but I want it to be something that incites something within me and forces me to remember, what am I doing for a living? I'm trying to be an analyst, so I want to analyze. I want the dashboard to give me some clues where to start analyzing, where to start looking at that data. So it's in some cases having a lot of those stimulants there is fine. I think it's sometimes a very crowded dashboard is important. For example, if you're working as a developer, having a radiator or kind of a build dashboard is really important. You need to be at a glance be able to see exactly which parts of your code base are breaking. But this kind of executive dashboard, I would start with a handful of stuff that throw that stuff into the dashboard, and then in our weekly meetings we'll see what sticks and what needs to be rehashed or removed entirely.
I could continue this forever, but I feel like ending with like you, Marie, condoing my straw man is too epic. I've got this vision of you holding up a metric and asking, does this metric bring you joy?
I think that's it. I just found a new niche for myself. I think that's what I'll start doing with my blog, like just Marie Kondoing people's data. That would be great.
Oh God, we accidentally came across something here. Okay. Oh, Simo, we're moving to rapid fire, and I need to ask you to keep your responses brief and on topic. Are you ready?
I'm not ready, but we'll see what happens.
What is one tech tool or website that you or your organization has started using in the last year?
There's no single tool, but I would say that the entire suite of Google Cloud Platform has been really top of mind for me and my organization.
What tech issues are you specifically battling with?
Currently, I'm battling with browsers and their cookie restrictions, ITP from Safari and ETP from Firefox, and I'm looking at what Chrome will do.
Talk about a mistake that you made earlier in your career that now shapes the way you do things today.
I think one mistake that I did was start blogging. It's so time consuming sometimes, but it's a happy mistake in the end. But I have spent countless hours without any clear return on investment. So I think the fact that I'm living a happy life now is the best result that I could have dreamed of.
If I were to put you in a hot tub time machine, back to the beginning of when you started your work, say with Google Analytics and Tag Manager, what advice would you give yourself?
Be more aggressive. Be more aggressive in how you question the validity of the data you're seeing. Don't buy into this has to be good data because it's Google, or this has to be good data because it's Adobe. Just be more vigilant about the data that you're looking at.
What is something that you think you or your organization should stop doing?
Stop listening to vendor pitches.
If I were to give you a Harry Potter style wand for the industry, what would it do?
Stop people listening to vendor pitches. I'm not usually that anti-vendor, but I've just had a couple of really bad run-ins lately, and I'm kind of on edge about that.
How did you get started in your sector?
This is a huge origin story, so I'll just tie it together by saying that I was a researcher at the university, researching English language, and I was researching empirical studies, and I got fascinated by what empirical data can give us, and turning that into software development and marketing was like a perfect match of my nerd at heart, but researcher by profession.
What advice would you give current college grads looking to go into the data and analytics space?
Trust no one. Be vigilant. Like this theme keeps on popping up, but just please ask questions. Please don't buy into the like best practices or buy into this. Just please be critical. Be critical of what you read and what you hear. It applies to everything, to politics as well, but especially to everything going on in our industry.
What career advice did your parents give you originally that you either followed or didn't follow?
I think it's hard to remember all the advice they've given me, but particularly about my career. But I think the important thing was just go with it, was their advice, because I was a researcher at the university, and I was very unhappy there for many reasons. And I think that they instilled in me that having a cultural education is great because you can professionally do whatever you want. Your university studies don't necessarily need to lead you to a profession. So enjoy those studies and cherish them, but you are free to look at whatever you want. And that's what I followed.
Well, Simo, final question. How do people find you? How do people help you?
Right. So the best place to find me is all the possible support and community forums around Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics, but particularly I would highlight Measure Slack, which is a Slack organization for all people working with analytics and data. It's one of the greatest places for inspirational talks, chats with industry professionals. Then obviously my blog, simoahava.com, will have those URLs in the show notes. And then I'm very active on Twitter if there's one single social medium where you'll want to follow me.
Brilliant, Simo. It has been such a pleasure. We had some fun here. And thank you so much for sharing your time and talents with us. It's much appreciated.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine. This was a great and inspiring talk, and we came up with a new business idea, so we'll start working with that as well.
The funny thing is they think we're kidding.
I know. Joke's on them, though.
This has been episode number 143. You can find resources associated with this episode at wholewhale.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us. This has been Using the Whole Whale. For more resources on today's show, please visit wholewhale.com/podcast and consider following us on Twitter at wholewhale. and thanks for joining us. Music by Greg Thomas, music.org. Awesome stuff, Greg. We miss you. Thanks for the music.